Next is the Value of Best Practices Report, 2016 update. The Performance Assessment Committee used 1010 data to assess best practice scores to measure the impact CII can have on your projects and your organization. Please welcome Jim O'Connor, C.T. Wells Professor of Project Management at the University of Texas at Austin.
Thank you. This morning I'm happy to represent the Performance Assessment Committee in its periodic update on the Value of Best Practices report. Let me begin by acknowledging the participation and contributions of our PAC members. As you can see, 12 member companies are currently represented in the committee's activities. These folks are all committed to learning more from project performance data. And I want to give special recognition to Noah Kahn with Kaiser Permanente, who has been with the committee since 2008 and has been instrumental in championing benchmarking in the healthcare sector. Thanks, Noah, who is retiring this fall. What is a best practice? It is a process or method that, when executed effectively, leads to enhanced project performance. CII has formally scrutinized and established 17 best practices by examining both extent of industry implementation and the significance of their impacts on capital projects. The Performance Assessment Committee periodically assesses such impacts through project performance benchmarking, an effort in which many of your companies participate. This presentation is a brief update on the value of the Best Practices report by that name. Here are the 17 best practices, sequenced in the order in which they were established. This last year, we welcomed advanced work packaging and planning for modularization as new best practices. As I'm sure you'll agree, these best practices are at the core of CII and its impact on capital projects. Now let's briefly review the history of CII Project Performance Assessment, or benchmarking as it was formerly labeled. As you would expect, the initial efforts in the late 1980s focused on the gathering of project safety data. The effort was expanded in the mid-1990s to include project cost and schedule performance measures and their many associated success drivers, ultimately including best practice scores or measures of implementation. The Value of Best Practices report was first issued in 2003 and then updated in 2010. Web-based data mining was incorporated in 2009, and the briefer phase-oriented 1010 program was initiated in 2014. We are just now starting to reap the benefits from this new data. That brings us to today with the 2016 update of the Value of Best Practices report and its new emphasis on phase implementation scores and phase outcome scores. And now let's get our hands dirty with the data of performance assessment. There are two key questions on practice implementation that beg for answers. For starters, to what extent are our member companies implementing the best practices? Think of this as the effort component of the grade. We all know you won't succeed if you don't make the effort. And this data gets particularly interesting when we compare owner versus contractor extent of implementation. Yikes. I said this was going to get dirty. What on earth does all this mean? Let's break it down and chew the elephant one bite at a time. What we've got here are 10 of the 17 best practices strung across the bottom, along with their phases of implementation. Change management, for example, over the engineering, procurement, and construction phases. Plus practice implementation scores plotted vertically on a 0 to 5-point scale. And then to make things even more complicated, we've got owner scores in blue and contractor scores in, well, let's call it burnt orange. While it would have made this slide even busier, let's not forget N. That's our sample size, and it's important because it helps establish statistical significance. Though through the 1010 program, we have collected best practice data with sample sizes ranging from 51 to 142, depending on phase and practice. So please keep contributing data to the system. So let's start with the good news. If we set a practice score threshold line at 4 out of 5, we see the most thoroughly implemented best practices in the green circles. 3 notable best practices stand out as the implementation leaders: planning for startup for both owners and contractors, but only during engineering; change management only by contractors and only during engineering; and zero accident techniques during construction. We applaud our member companies for investing so wisely in these efforts. But what about everything below the green line? So there's bad news, which of course could also indicate competitive advantage opportunities. Here I've lowered the threshold to 3.0 out of 5, and unfortunately, there are lots of interesting findings in these red circles below the line. 3 notable best practices stand out as the implementation laggards: constructability for both owners and contractors during front-end planning, quality management for owners during engineering, procurement, and construction, and materials management during engineering and construction. Constructability, quality, and materials management. What could be more essential to project success? We definitely have our work cut out for us. And performance assessment helps us see results like this more clearly. Allow me to briefly digress from the performance assessment discussion. As a member company, what can you do when you discover bad news like that shown on the previous slide? As of 2 weeks ago, you can now consult the brand new CII Knowledgebase to gain fresh insight into resources available to facilitate appropriate and needed change within your organization. As depicted in this screenshot, once you're in the Knowledgebase website, we recommend you select the Best Practices portal, followed by the appropriate best practice, such as materials management, depicted here. Scroll down to the project phase of interest, for example, construction, and from here, expect to find all kinds of resources and their descriptions that can help elevate your level of implementation for that selected practice. Now, back to our too busy chart and a few more red circles to discuss. Look at the fishtails. What is going on here? A few of our score plots between owners and contractors start out in sync, but then begin to diverge. In fact, it appears that there is lack of alignment between owners and contractors with regard to both the alignment and team building best practices as teams proceed through to construction and then startup. How is that for irony? This deserves a longer conversation. You certainly won't want to miss that discussion in our breakout session. So implementation scores, like we've discussed, provide insight into how thoroughly or rigorously our teams execute the best practices. That's very informative. But what we are all really interested in is understanding how these practices positively impact our project and phase performances. Based on data collected through the 1010 program, the practice impact scatter plot with regression line depicted here is an example of such a finding. This analysis shows that on average, for every unit of improvement in alignment during the construction phase, measured here on the 5-point x-axis scale, we see a 7.6% drop in construction cost growth. That's great case for action information that project teams need to act upon. In the breakout session, we will cover more findings like this on the construction phase, as well as those for other phases. So come to our implementation session where our panel will share more benchmarking learnings and discussion points. You'll hear more about practice scores, practice impacts, ironic differences between owners and contractors, and how you too can use the 1010 system and the new knowledge base to great advantage. Please join me along with James Blaschke of ConocoPhillips, Chad Hodevec of Burns & McDonnell, Mark Stofega from Fluor, and Daniel Oliveira from CII for more benchmarking enlightenment in National Harbor 12 and 13. Thank you very much.